One more thing I want to talk to you about is backlog grooming. This is one of the things that happens within a sprint. It's called backlog grooming or backlog refinement. So once the sprint is live, you also want to prep for your next sprint. So those stories you're already grooming. You're making sure the conversations are happening, the confirmations are happening, the user stories are there, so that we could bring it while the sprint is happening. We look at the next sprint and we say, okay, these are some of the things that we need to talk about. And it's almost like a workshop, and you're kind of looking at what kind of problems we need to solve, what are the different potential solutions, and you're adding more details to the user stories in that backlog grooming session. So pretty much you're grooming your backlog, you're adding more details to your backlog user stories and getting them ready for the next sprint.
Yeah, and that's, as a business analyst, that's a very interesting point. When you're working as a business analyst or other roles, I'm saying business analyst in a very loose term. But when you're working in that, you are, for half of that sprint, pretty much working in that sprint. And for half that sprint, you're kind of working out of that sprint because you're looking ahead to the next. You need to prep everything so those user stories are ready.
100%.
So then they're ready to be pulled out. So if you are, most of the time, those business analysts, the product owner will get it in there, but then it's up to the team to iterate on that and keep checking back with that product owner to make sure that it's in line with their vision when they kind of created that initial user story.
100%.
So that was actually always a tough thing as a business analyst, is balancing between the current and the next and making sure that you're getting everything done.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
As we've discussed with Scrum, there's several ceremonies that are done on a daily or by sprint basis. So what we want to do here is just give you some context, give you some understanding of what your calendar could look like with those various ceremonies, whether you're using a 1-week sprint versus a 2-week sprint. So the one we're going to look at first is the 1-week sprint. The first day of the sprint, our first thing, we have our sprint planning. That's pretty obvious. We need to go through, we need to plan out our sprint. We need to make our commitments of the user stories that we're going to be completing in that sprint. So that's on Monday morning. Sometimes it's even done the day previous, prior to Monday, so that way it can be planned and committed to prior to the sprint actual starting. But nonetheless, there's a sprint planning meeting that's done right at the beginning of that sprint. The second day, all we're doing is our daily scrum. Remember, that's our daily stand-up meeting, 15 minutes, get in a room, talk about what we worked on yesterday, what we're working on today, and any impediments or roadblocks or issues that the team is running into. So that Tuesday, that second day of the sprint, is really a big work day. Wednesday, we again do the daily scrum. Obviously, that's going to be a daily occurrence where we go over those 3 questions. What did I work on yesterday? What am I working on today? And what are issues or roadblocks that I'm running into? Also on that third day of the sprint, however, we have our backlog refinement or grooming. And what we're doing is we're actually grooming or refining the product backlog. That sprint backlog that we've committed to is being worked and we're moving that forward. Now we're looking at that product backlog and we're going through and we're making sure that our next batch of user stories have enough details in there to be estimated and to eventually be committed on in a future sprint. So we go through, we're grooming and refining those user stories. The fourth day is the sprint in a 1-week sprint. We have our daily scrum, our daily stand-up, so we do that. And on the last day, we're again doing our daily stand-up, but later in the afternoon, we have 2 additional ceremonies. The first ceremony that's usually scheduled is the sprint review. This is where we're going to demo out, show off what we completed as part of that sprint, maybe identify those user stories that we committed to but for some reason wasn't able to get done, talk about those user stories that maybe we didn't commit to but were able to get complete if we were ahead of schedule, and that sort of thing. So we have that sprint review, and then usually either right after that or shortly after that, we have our sprint retrospective. This is where we get together with the team and we're discussing how did the sprint go? Are there things that we can do differently? Did we overcommit, undercommit? Were there certain roles, responsibilities that people had that we could accomplish? So that is done as part of that sprint retrospective. And that's what your calendar could look like with a 1-week sprint. And honestly, trying to get that much work done or get user stories done in 5 days is extremely difficult. You really have to break those user stories down. So most often, I don't see a lot of companies going with the 1 week sprint. Most of them are going with a 2 week sprint. So let's go ahead and take a look at that one next. The first thing you'll notice is the first ceremony is exactly the same. We have our sprint planning. Regardless of the length of your sprint, you need to plan out that sprint. There's commitments that need to be made on those user stories that are going to be completed as part of that sprint. But what you will notice is because it's a 2 week sprint rather than a 1 week sprint planning can last up to 4 hours, which is quite a bit longer than what we had in the 1 week side. The second day, we have the same thing. We have our daily scrum or our daily stand-up, 15-minute meeting. We're getting together, talking about what we worked on yesterday, what we're working on today, and any impediments or roadblocks we're running into. Third day of the sprint, very similar to the week 1 or 1 week sprint, and that is the fact that we are doing backlog refinement and grooming. This is refining and grooming the backlog stories that are on that product backlog, not the sprint backlog. What we've committed to as part of this sprint is locked in. We shouldn't be hopefully updating those user stories at all. They're all estimated and ready to roll, but we are going through and making sure that the other user stories out in that product backlog have enough information that they can be prioritized, estimated, and hopefully committed to in a future sprint. The remainder of that first week, we are just doing our daily stand-up. So the week 1 is usually a very busy work week as you're getting started on those user stories and moving them along. Let's take a look at week 2. Second week of the sprint is very similar. We started off that first day, it's a full work day other than our daily stand-up. On that Tuesday, we have our daily stand-up and then a backlog refinement or grooming. Generally, you're doing those once a week. So we've got that. We then have our daily stand-ups on the next 2 days. And the last day of the sprint, again, same as the 1 week sprint, we have our daily stand-up. Later in the afternoon, we have our sprint review and then sprint retrospective. Those meetings are going to probably last a little bit longer. You're generally going to have a little bit more to talk about because you've attempted or hopefully completed additional user stories or more user stories in a 2 week sprint than what you would in a 1 week sprint. So I hope going through and giving just these brief examples do help you to understand kind of what your daily routine would look like as you're working in this. We do have these calendars available for download as PDF files on this lecture. So go out there, snag them, and go ahead and put them with your notes. Use them for context and reference. Now that you have a good overview of Scrum and you understand a little bit about what the various roles are within the team, now we're going to start diving into a little bit more detail. In this section, we're going to highlight some of the key Scrum terms and artifacts that are going to be extremely critical to your further learning.
In this lecture, we're going to talk about user stories. What are user stories? User story is a simple description of a product feature that is written from end user's point of view. That means whenever we're writing this product increment, we are thinking about the customer. Now let's look at how do we capture this user story and what is captured in the user stories. The first thing that you want to look at is the who. Who is the user? What kind of customers are they? This helps developers to really think about and empathize with the customer who's actually going to be using this software. When we deliver this product increment, what will we empower our customers to do? What is their goal? And then the last thing that we want to capture in this user story is why. What kind of value will it bring if we are able to deliver this user story to the customer? Let's look at a format that most of the companies use. As a user or type of a user, I want a goal. I want to solve a certain kind of problem, or that is more of a what. The third piece of the user story is so that I can achieve some value or why. So the who, what, and why can be captured by using this format of the user story. Now let's look at how do we write a good user story. Is user story just a requirement document or something that replaces the requirement document? User story is not a document. User story is more of a conversation. It's a lightweight description of what the user might want in this software. There's a really neat way of thinking about a user story, and this is an acronym called 3 C's. 3 C's stands for card, conversation, and confirmation. If you look at the first step, card, this really means that product owner, after he talks to the customer or the stakeholders, comes back to the team with a 3x5 card that captures who, what, and why. And this is just a high-level need of the user. Remember how there is not a lot of description added or a lot of time spent in documentation. This is just a 3x5 card that just only has a necessary piece of information, and that's brought to the team where the conversation actually happens. So that's the second piece, conversation. Team members and product owner discuss about this card. Okay, who is this user story for? You say this is a first-time patient? Great. What do they want? What kind of problem are we solving? So that's where we discuss who, what, and why. This really helps developers to understand how they want to build this product increment. The third step is confirmation. The team will then go talk to the product owner. The development team is confirming that what they have understood is same as what product owner or customers have in mind, just to avoid any confusion. So by just going through these three things, card, conversation, and confirmation, you can write a quality user story. Acceptance criteria are simple notes or conditions added to the user story that tells what the user story must do so that it can satisfy the need of the customer that is defined by the product owner. It should be clear, concise, and product owner should be able to verify it. We talked about the 3 C's. Acceptance criteria shows up in the confirmation phase where team members and product owner are collaboratively discussing and coming to an agreement on the acceptance criteria of the user story. Again, these conditions of acceptance statements are known as acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria enriches the user story by making it testable, and also it ensures the story by making it demoable to the stakeholders or the product holders or the external customers. Product owner writes the acceptance criteria and brings them to the team, and they decide and come to a common agreement on what acceptance criteria should be part of that user story. So let's look at an example. Using our very simple user story format, we're going to define who, what, and why. As a new student, I want to be able to create a new account on theagilecoach.com so that I can enroll into a course. This is a very simple story. How can we add more details and how can we make this story more testable and clear? Well, we can add 3 acceptance criteria in this that defines the entry method. Create an account through LinkedIn, create an account through Google, and create an account through Facebook. These 3 conditions are very specific. These are 3 login and account creation portals, and it's really easy for developers to understand. They need to integrate with these 3 platforms and allow the new students to log in and create accounts from these 3 social media platforms. Lastly, you want to remember these 3 things. Acceptance criteria should be testable with clearly defined pass-fail results. The acceptance criteria should be clear and concise. Developers should be able to understand it. No poetic language or philosophical statements, just to avoid any confusions. And acceptance criteria is established with shared understanding between the team and the product owner. One might ask a question, how many acceptance criteria per user story? This is totally up to teams. I recommend teams write anywhere between 3 to 7 acceptance criteria. And it's more than that, they can always split that user story into 2. Let's look at a technique called INVEST, and we are going to look at this acronym to write quality user stories. Usually most of the people, when they think of a user story, they just think of this simple format. As a user, I want this goal so that I can achieve this. You can compare this to an analogy of an iceberg. That is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the value comes when you can pay attention to the INVEST acronym of the user story. What do I mean by that? Let's look at these guidelines on writing great user stories. The first one is independent. Independent just means that when you're writing a user story, you don't have any dependency with any other user story, and a team can pick it and get it to done without having to depend on any other user stories. The second one is negotiable. Whenever product owner or product manager is coming to the team and he's bringing the card based on his understanding of the needs and the goals of the users, this user story should be negotiable. Meaning once after talking to the team, if the product owner has a better idea, this user story should be flexible so that it can change and adapt to the needs of the user. The third one is valuable, that this user story has some concrete value to the users. The fourth one is estimatable. This just means if you have a user story, you should have some idea on how much complexity this story has. The fifth thing is small. It should be small enough for team members to finish this in a few days. And the last thing is testable. Whenever you're writing your user stories, you should be able to test that user story. And if you pay attention to these 6 things, you will be able to come up with great user stories.
And before we move on to other artifacts and terms, we want to talk to you a little bit about a downloadable resource that we have available attached to this lecture. So one of the key things about learning user stories is being able to see a bunch of examples of actual user stories, and that'll help you get some context and help you wrap your arms around the overall concept of user stories and how they apply within projects. As I mentioned, attached to this lecture is a resource with 35 example user stories. The first 10 user stories actually have the user story, the as a, I want to, so that portion of the user story, as well as acceptance criteria, as well as sometimes some description and additional details or wireframes for that user story. So the first 10 user stories are a little bit more in depth and have all those details as part of it. This should help give you a little bit more understanding and context to what a user story in a real project would look like. Once we get through those 10, the next 25 user stories are just the user story. So we didn't include any acceptance criteria or wireframes here. This is just to give you more perspective and more ideas as to what user stories could be all about. So hop out to the resources of this lecture, download a copy of the example user stories, and utilize it to help refine your understanding of user stories.
So let's look at the product backlog. Product backlog is a list of user stories collected by the product owner by talking to the users and stakeholders. And one of the most important thing about the product backlog is actually prioritize. So the highest priority
One more thing
I want to talk to you about is backlog grooming. This is one of the things that happens. This is an ever-increasing list because the wishes and the needs of the user are infinite, right?
Yep.
So it's up to the product owner on the regular basis. Product owner will update this and put the highest priority items on the top. And this is where the Scrum team can pull the stories from the top because they know that those are the highest priority items. So the product backlog should reflect the product vision. What are they trying to build? The product backlog should have a pretty good sequence on how products should be built.
Sure, all the needs of the business. The huge, long laundry list of the needs, the wants, the shoulds, the coulds, right?
100%.
And then you kind of mentioned that the team then selects ones that are on the top, and so we kind of talked about the product backlog, so let's transition that into like a sprint backlog.
Yep, that is the second artifact. So we have the prioritized list of user stories that is called the product backlog that the product owner owns. In one of the Scrum ceremonies, which is sprint planning, this is what product owner comes with. He comes with the product backlog, highest priority items, and he says these are the highest priority items. Scrum team, let's discuss these. Let's just look at the user stories. How many of these can we get done in this iteration of the sprint? And if it's a 2-week iteration, the team is thinking, okay, we have 2 weeks and we have to, whatever story that we say yes to, we have to get this to done.
Yeah, we have to fully define it. Design it, build it, test it, get it ready.
And it should work. And, it has acceptance criteria too. So for them to understand what's the scope of the user story. At the end of the sprint, they will demo this work. They will almost show it to the user base of the stakeholders. So that is your sprint backlog.
Awesome. So those are the committed user stories that will be completed in that sprint.
100%.
Based on what the team says, yes, this is what we can do.
Yep. And who owns the sprint backlog? That would be the team. So let's look at the working agreement. This is outside of a Scrum framework, but working agreement is used by a lot of team members. And just like it sounds like, working agreement is when we work in a team, what are some of the rules?
What's the expectations?
Yeah, what are the expectations? Those are some of the things that needs to be there, explicitly there, for where everybody can get access to it. So we all know that this is a multiplayer game. There are some agreements there so everybody can play together and nobody's mad or nobody's unheard, so we can make that very explicit for the team.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that came up because we're collaborating as a team, right? There's no manager, project manager dictating, hey, you got to get your stuff done. Why aren't you getting your stuff done? Hey, you didn't get your stuff done.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's a collaboration. So everybody needs to say, yes, I agree to what the team is saying, and I can do my part to make that happen.
Yeah.
And so it's important. When I actually started at a company and they had that, I had always thought before that they were pretty frivolous. But when I worked into a new team that they had been working on a project for over a year, they had the working agreement, magneted up to their whiteboard. When I walked in the room, one of the first things they said is, read this. And I read it, and it was a one-page document, but it talked a lot about what they were looking to accomplish and what the expectations were for people that were part of that team.
Yeah.
And it was really just looking, here's what we expect of you as a team member.
And you know, a lot of the times there's a lot of challenges happening in the team because there are a lot of assumed and not talked about agreements, right? This should happen, but why haven't you talked about it, right? Yep. So this is actually, even if somebody doesn't agree to an agreement, this allows for a conversation so that everybody's voice is heard. And now we know, if, like, you know, for example, a developer said to me, is like, I don't like being interrupted, and if you're gonna come and actually ask me a question, please ping me that you're coming, because I literally get scared if you come. So now we all agree that, hey, we're not gonna just go and say, hey, how's it going? Because that's important for that team member. It is a living document where it's available to everybody, and it's also a changing document. If some agreement doesn't work out for the team, then that can change. For example, you know, we had a working agreement that our working hours were from 8 to 5, and summertime happened, and one of the developers had to drop the kids in the school in the morning.
Oh, sure, yep. So
and
they're a little late.
Yeah, so we just changed literally from 8 o'clock to 9:30, and then we moved our stand-up, and it was as simple as having the agreement. Instead of this person showing up late in the stand-up, we just talked about it and we just update our working agreement.
You guys are on one team going towards one goal, work together,
100%.
right?
So that is the essence of working agreement.
So for students, the working agreement, you're going to find it in a lot of different organizations. It's not required by any means, and it's not even part of Scrum, but a lot of companies and a lot of organizations have picked it up to help them solve some of those problems before they become problems, to really get ahead of everything.
100%. Definition of ready is one of the most important part of the working agreement. Setting up definition of ready is Scrum Master's one of the crucial responsibilities as well. Usually in teams, definition of ready applies to the user story. Again, what is a user story? User story is a very simple, brief statement describing the feature or the work that has to be done by the developer from an end user's perspective. So how does a team member know when the user story is ready? Most of the time what we see is definition ready has that the user story actually has who, what, and why. Who is the customer, who is going to use it, or the end users, what do they want, and why do we need it? What is the reason why we're working on this story? So those three things are crucial in a user story. The other thing that's very crucial in user story is the acceptance criteria. So what are the criteria for this user story to be done? That needs to be there before a developer can pick up the story and start working. So overall, definition of ready means the user story is actionable. The user story has what needs to be done and the amount of work and the complexity of the work, obviously having the acceptance criteria. So when you read the user story, it should be clear, concise, and actionable. Let's look at definition of done. I used to have a friend who I used to work with in a software development environment. Whenever I used to ask him, are you done with this user story or piece of work? He said, I am almost done. I am this close to being done. And whenever you are this close to being done, that doesn't mean you're done. Let's look at what we mean by definition of done. This is an agreement document that team creates so that it's accessible by everybody and it is a common understanding that everybody has at that point of time, and it's an ever-evolving document. What we mean by that is when team starts with a checklist of items, when these items in the checklist are done, we know this story is done. Let's look at a unit of work. Take a user story. How do we know when we are done with the user story? One of the things that I've used in my team is start with a very simple document. For one of the teams that I used to coach, it was as simple as this: that user story meets the acceptance criteria by the product owner. So whatever product owner said, those conditions of acceptance, that piece of work actually includes those. The other thing is it's properly tested. The other checklist in the definition of done document is there is code review or peer review in that story or that piece of code. And once we have all that, we need two more things. We need a lightweight documentation on what was being done in that user story. And then the last thing is the story must be given to a product owner for review. And if we finish all those things, we would consider this story or piece of work is done. Let's say, for example, if there's a new team member who joins the team, it is so easy for that team member to look at the working agreement, and part of that is definition of done, and they can look at it and they can know exactly where the team's mindset and agreements are in place, so they know what to do. Following the working agreement, they would complete a user story, they would make sure the user story has all the acceptance criteria in place. They would test the story, or they would actually give it to another team member. There will be code review. There will be a lightweight update on Confluence or Jira on how the story was implemented. And the last thing is they would pass that story to the product owner and explain to product owner, here, this story is done. And when a new team member agrees to this definition of done, then everybody is in the same page, and it can really help team gain productivity versus getting into the argument is, oh, this is not actually done, or this is almost done and I just need to implement this, or I just need to test it in this browser. Those things can actually take a lot of time, and there's a lot of handoffs that can happen within the user story whenever you don't have an explicit definition of done. One of the things that we want to make sure is we want to make this document visual, and you want to put it in a place where everybody can access it. For example, I had this document in a team room in a poster, and some of the developers actually printed this definition of done and actually posted in their cubicle so that it almost reminds them what a definition of done means. Jeremy, I want to take this time to talk about two of the very important artifacts of Scrum that are not mentioned in the Scrum guide.
Okay.
But this is very important. So these are definition of ready and definition of done. And let's just look at definition of ready. Just like it sounds like, definition of ready is an agreement that a team produces that for us to be able to pick up the work, for us to know that this user story is ready, what are some things that we need in that user story? So for example, the user story should have who, what, and why.
Yep.
The user story should have an acceptance criteria, a clear acceptance criteria.
In a company that I worked for, we used to say it was polished.
Yeah.
That user story is polished. It means it has everything that's needed for that development team to pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, because it doesn't help when somebody picks up the story and then they're still ambiguous, or
oh man, I gotta get more details.
So the condition for starting that story is the definition of ready. And it's very explicit in a team member. If a new team member comes in, it's good to be able to see the team, go to the team document and see, okay, well, this is what it means for this team to have a ready story.
Yep, this is what the user story must contain or must be a part of to be considered ready.
Yeah. So let's look at a definition of done. So what is a definition of done? It's pretty much, again, another agreement for the team. So the team members are saying that, what does it mean for this team to get a story to done? Does it mean that the story is dev complete and it's not tested? How many times do we get a story, oh, this is almost done, this is done, but this piece I have to update it. So that's not done, right?
Yep.
So
it's nearly done.
Yeah. So
we can't deliver it, right? That's 100%. The big thing.
Yeah, 100%. So again, this is a team agreement that they set out. For this team, done means that development work is done. This has code review part of it. The unit testing is done for this user story, and this is accepted by product owner. The testing has done not only the regular testing but the integration testing so that this user story didn't break the rest of the features. So those are some of the examples on how team defines their definition of done.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because in previous lectures we've heard you say done. That story is done.
Yeah.
And that just really means that it's not only done by development, it's not only done by testing, it's gone through the full gamut and everybody agrees, both from the business side, which is done by the product owner. They're the one that's from the business side that's saying it's done. Plus the project team. Everybody's like, yes, it's ready to go. It's ready to go live, assuming that the demo goes well and everybody likes the feature.
100%.
In this lecture, we're going to talk about what a product increment is. According to the Scrum Guide, a product increment is a potentially shippable vertical slice of a solution that's created as part of a sprint time box. That definition has a lot of terms and it can be very confusing. So what I want to do is actually use an illustration to explain what a product increment is. Let's first start with a traditional methodology, such as a waterfall methodology. On the screen, you'll see a little chart. From left to right is time. So as time goes on, we move towards the right. The way traditional methodologies have it broken up is you have your various stages. So you have your analysis stage. Once you're complete with your analysis, you're done with your analysis, you move on to your requirements stage, then your design stage, and on throughout the project. You don't go back to a previous stage, you continue moving forward. The challenge with this is you don't actually release anything of use or value to the business until the end of the project, until that full cycle is done. So let's say pretty early on in the project, the business wants to stop the project or wants to gain some value from it. I'm sorry, you can't. We've completed our analysis and started our requirements, but there's really nothing to deliver to you to help you out. So that is a traditional methodology. Now let's take a look at an Agile methodology. It takes these stages and it still uses them, but it flips them on their head. So instead of going from stage to stage to stage throughout time, the stages are listed vertically. So when you now have a slice and you do a vertical slice, that's where that term comes from. So you do a vertical slice on that product, now you have this product increment. So at a certain point of time, which is a sprint or a time box, so within that 1 to 4 week time frame, you are creating a potentially shippable product increment. Now you do that over and over on every single sprint, and you're creating these product increments. To explain this with another type of example, everybody's had some type of application software, either on their phone or on some type of desktop computer, that once every couple weeks, once a month, that you get some type of update. It's now version 1.46, and then it's 1.47 a little bit later in a couple weeks, 1.48. What they're doing is they're shipping you product increments. They're shipping you new features and changes and updates that they've made to the application, and they're doing that over and over and over. So you can start to realize that value. And that product increment's only going to contain a couple features, a couple new things, a couple changes. But when they do that over and over and over, and they continue to deliver that to you, you're able to continue to realize that value rather than waiting for all of their features as part of this project to be complete. So product increment is a vertical slice of a potentially shippable product that's developed as part of a sprint time box.